Each era of American history roughly correlates to a musical phenomenon. In the 50s, it was rock and roll. In the 60s, it was the music of Woodstock. And in the 70s, it was disco. Today, we're going to take you through the rise and fall of disco. First, what exactly is disco music? Disco music is a conglomeration of musical elements pioneered by the LGBTQ+ Black and Latino communities in the 60s. That disco rhythm that you are likely familiar with is one called 4 on the floor, which is a beat in 4/4 time in which the bass drum is hit on every beat in common time. This is what makes disco so effortlessly danceable and catchy. In addition to the 4 on the floor beat, disco uses synthesizers, electric rhythm guitars, string sections, horns, electric pianos, and syncopated bass lines to create its unique sound. Disco in the United States has its origins primarily in Philadelphia and New York City. In Philly, R&B and soul music created by Black and Latino musicians laid the groundwork for disco music. And in New York City, disco found its beginnings in underground dance clubs where the LGBTQ+ community could safely congregate. Essentially, disco music, which was originally created by marginalized groups, was predominantly listened to by the members of those groups. Disco wasn't just music for them. It represented being able to freely express oneself without fear of racist or homophobic discrimination. This discrimination was evident. The reason why dance clubs where disco music was played were underground was because there were laws across the United States that made it illegal for people of the same sex to dance together in a place that had a liquor license. It became nearly impossible for the LGBTQ+ community to express themselves together in public. Additionally, racism was rampant, and typical bars and clubs did not provide safe spaces for people of color to be in them comfortably. Therefore, underground clubs became places where these marginalized groups could come together and listen to the music that their communities were making in a free environment. In the mid to late 60s across the US, the LGBTQ+ community protested against sodomy laws, specifically the ones that were criminalizing displays of same-sex relations. These protests primarily occurred in New York and New Jersey and led to the overturning of the discriminatory laws. Our location and timeline now centers itself in New York City in the early 70s. Gay bars started to open up and disco was the predominant music playing. While disco had primarily been an underground subculture in the late 60s, it rose in popularity as dance clubs opened up across New York City. The Loft, Paradise Garage, and The Gallery were some of the most notable nightclubs in the early 70s, founded by David Mancuso. The Loft was the first of the real disco clubs to set a precedent of what the disco experience should be like. The DJ, short for disc jockey, was perhaps the most essential part of the disco club. While music at dance clubs had previously been supplied by live bands, DJs at disco clubs would use their multi-record turntables and DJ mixers to create a continuous mix of songs. In order to prevent any interruptions in the dancing, each song had a seamless transition into the next without any break in the music. DJs had complete control over the atmosphere as well. In addition to the music, they controlled the lights, speakers, and even the temperature, all from their booths. Popular DJs like Nicky Ciano, David Mancuso, and Larry Levin were praised for their ability to get people on their feet and dancing for hours on end, and overall providing an exciting and entertaining night. The DJ was also the unofficial salesperson for disco music outside the club. Since disco was never played on the radio in the early 70s, it was the job of the DJ to indirectly sell the music to the club attendees. What would happen is the people at the clubs would hear the DJ playing a song and, if they liked it, they would go to the record store and buy the record. This slowly but surely led to disco records landing on the Billboard charts. But even when disco records were selling thousands and thousands of copies in popular music hubs like New York City, radio stations were still adamant of not playing it. Tom Moulton, an American record producer, explains this puzzling case when Gloria Gaynor's song Never Can Say Goodbye was a hit at the dance clubs in 1975. He says, In Billboard, they put a whole page saying, "Will someone explain to me how a record can sell 20,000 copies in New York City in a week and not one radio station is playing it? How can this be?" And finally, the record station started playing it. With the radio stations on board, disco music was reaching wider audiences across the country. A wider reach not only meant the popularization of disco music, but disco dance styles as well, the most famous being the hustle. Essentially, just a partner dance. You have probably done a variation of the hustle yourself. It quickly became a hallmark of the disco scene. Overall, disco dancing was revolutionary within itself, as it included more touching than 60s style dancing, which was done more individually and with little touch. The hustle craze took over the country towards the end of 1975, proving more and more just how much of a moneymaker disco could be. Eventually, the music industry saw that they could make a large profit off the disco scene. Disco records began being mass-produced, and the music followed a formula that record labels knew would make the album sell. Disco was everywhere across the globe. It spread like wildfire. But because record labels were pumping out these mechanicalized records, the music was losing its melody, meaning, and overall that original thing that made it so special. And compared to the music popular that came prior to it, like rock and roll or jazz, there weren't any real disco personalities. Record labels manufactured bands that weren't really bands, just a group of musicians coming together to record the album. Additionally, many disco artists were one-hit wonders and didn't have a real presence behind their music other than the one or two songs they were known for. Then enter the Bee Gees with Saturday Night Fever in 1977, and everything changed. With their music for the popular film, disco became bigger than ever before. Songs like Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, and More Than a Woman dominated the charts, and the soundtrack album became the best-selling album in history. The love for the film and the music was one of the greatest cultural phenomenons of all time, perhaps even rivaling Beatlemania. The Bee Gees were everything, and they took over representation of disco, even if they didn't want to or mean to. Alongside the success of Saturday Night Fever was the opening of Studio 54, the most famous Manhattan nightclub of the disco era. Launching at the peak of disco in 1977, Studio 54 was the place to be. Cher, Freddie Mercury, Liza Minnelli, Diana Ross, and Andy Warhol are just a few of the celebrities that frequented this famous nightclub. Like all the disco clubs in New York City at the time, Studio 54 was not only a place for music, but fashion and substance use as well. A fashion show within itself, guests showed up in iconic looks that changed fashion for the everyday American. Open club substance use also meant that the night lasted until the early morning hours. During the short-lived era of Studio 54, the success of Saturday Night Fever further motivated record labels to produce disco albums, even if they weren't any good. They saw the chance to capitalize off of the disco craze, and they ran with it. Nicky Ciano, the famous disco DJ, explains the beginning of the end of disco. He says, "In the beginning, you would buy a disco-banded record and it would be a great song, no matter which one you picked out. But then, some executive in diapers decided, let's put disco on all these records we want to sell. And it wasn't good music anymore. It was garbage." Ciano explains it perfectly. As record labels began releasing tacky and lifeless music, the word disco was put on anything and everything to make it sell. So people began to move away from disco. But some did so in a hateful way. By the end of the 70s, the formulaic music and oversaturation of disco aesthetics in the mainstream led to an anti-disco movement. People criticized it for being mindless, consumerist, and overdone, and slogans such as "disco sucks" and "death to disco" became increasingly popular. This hatred came to its peak on Disco Demolition Night in July of 1979, which was a protest against disco music during a baseball game at Comiskey Park in Chicago. The protest was led by Steve Dahl, a DJ on a radio station in Chicago who was famous for hating disco. Vince Lawrence, now a record producer, was working as an usher at Comiskey Park on Disco Demolition Night. Lawrence recounts the event saying, "Steve Dahl says, we're going to let everyone in the White Sox Park for 98 cents if you bring a disco record, and we're going to blow those records up in the middle of the center of the field. We're letting people in. I pointed out to my chief usher, that record, that record, that record, that record, that record, that record. Those aren't disco records. Those are just R&B records. And the thing that I noticed more than anything was it was mostly black records." Lawrence continues saying, "It was a racist and homophobic book burning, and the Bee Gees got caught up in that because they were part of that culture that was lifting a lot of people up. The Bee Gees did in fact receive tons of hatred, so much so that they retreated from the public eye and took a break from music for a while. Ultimately, people began calling Disco Demolition Night the day disco died, and this definitely holds some truth. On July 21st, 1979, the top 6 records on the US music charts were all disco songs, and by September 22nd, there were no disco songs in the US top 10 charts. The decline in disco after that hate-fueled night was rapid. Despite its decline and the mainstream direction it headed in towards the late 70s, disco remains an incredibly memorable and important moment in music history. Spearheaded by the LGBTQ+ Black and Latino communities, the great disco music, not that which was tainted by consumerism, must be remembered for having its origins in these communities. The disco music that came out of the early 70s and the culture of nightclubs where the music was listened to has left an eternal impact on society. Original disco paved the way for future musical genres, and dance clubs changed the way people consumed music, making it all the more fun. The way disco is depicted in the media often erases the contributions of the minority groups that played the biggest role in creating the iconic music. Therefore, learning about the history of disco is crucial. Knowing that it was originated in the LGBTQ+ Black and Latino communities means we are giving credit where credit is due. Well, that's all for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time.